The modern education system does not make you intelligent. In fact, in many ways, it's actually designed to do the opposite. Today, I'm going to share my experience as a former Ivy League student, a peer-reviewed academic researcher, and an educator to expose how the modern education system is destroying our critical thinking skills and what we can do about it. My realization that something was truly wrong with the education system started in college. I remember that feeling when I first set foot on my college campus as a freshman. I was filled with feelings of possibility, of optimism, of hope. Everyone had been telling me that college was different from high school. Finally, you could do what you wanted, study what you wanted, and explore any ideas you wanted. But I soon found out that college, like high school, was still a place of conformity. College was just a bit more subtle about it than high school. In high school, the pressure to conform is pretty obvious. You're told what to do, when to do it, and precisely what your value is based on your grades. But college, especially universities that focus on what is called the liberal arts philosophy, is different in its messaging. In fact, what I realized clearly during my time at college was that college communicates two distinct messages to you, each of them in constant conflict with each other. On the one hand, the message is drilled into you. Education is a good in itself. You should seek to be educated because education makes you a better, wiser, more thoughtful person. Yet, on the other hand, another message is drilled into you, namely, getting an education is important because it helps you get a better career, and you should do everything necessary while you're at college to position yourself for a good, stable career. So, while we all start out with the optimism and hope of the first message, after taking on student debt, feeling pressure from our family, or realizing the cost of college is basically a mortgage, which of these two messages do you think takes over in our mind? But why does this conflict exist anyway? I mean, if we look back to the ancient Athenians, universities in this wealthy city existed primarily for the purpose of the first message, cultivating minds, becoming wiser, and ultimately becoming a better person. So, what changed? And even more importantly, how can we change it? Well, when I got to my final year of my undergrad, I decided to write an undergraduate honors thesis, and I even got a paid grant to research and write it. The topic? The penitentiary and prison systems of the United States before the Civil War. And as I spent hours in archives and libraries reviewing both primary and secondary sources, something became chillingly clear. Prisons and schools were actually modeled after each other. You see, back in the 1830s, reform movements sprang up everywhere, and these movements had benevolent goals: improve the quality of prisons, hospitals, and yes, schools. The dominant thinking behind these reforms was a philosophy called environmentalism, stemming from the work of the thinker John Locke. Essentially, environmentalism taught that all people were born as blank slates, and that it was the environment that completely shaped who they would become. Therefore, so much of these reform movements was dedicated to obsessively designing the environment within prisons, schools, and other institutions so that the individuals within them could become better people. But here's where the problem started. What exactly was their standard for what a better person looked like? And how would this standard go on to effectively eliminate the practice of critical thinking within the education system? Well, to understand that, we also have to understand the economic context in which all these reform movements were happening. Amidst all these efforts was a rapidly industrializing economy which saw the rise of something incredibly disruptive: factory labor. While many initially viewed factory labor as evil, as it was catastrophic to the artisan journeyman system at the time, it wasn't long until reformers started to realize the efficiency of the factory system and the effect they believed repetitive work could have on the mind. Remember, they believed in Locke's blank slate concept, that if they could completely control every aspect of the environment, then they could completely control the development of students' minds. And so, as schools developed, they borrowed more and more from both the factory system and the prison system, both of which were based on the ideas of complete control and repetitive labor. Interestingly, these are two concepts that might help us become good workers, but which are antithetical to critical thinking. But you might ask, what's really wrong with having career development as the purpose of the education system? I mean, isn't it a good thing to want to help students develop a stable career path? Sure, this is a benevolent goal, but then again, What if someone wants to become an entrepreneur? Or what if making money isn't a person's sole life focus, but instead is secondary and is something they can figure out outside of school? I mean, especially in the digital age, if you have a smartphone and internet access, there are literally dozens of ways to start making money that don't require a formal education. Essentially, it raises the question, why does it even make sense to mix career and financial development with education in the first place? Why aren't they two completely separate domains? And in fact, if we're gonna combine the two, then we should ask an even more crucial question. What actually happens to our learning ability and critical thinking skills when our sole focus, instead of becoming a well-rounded person, becomes getting good grades to get a good job? The answer? You're not gonna like it. When I started an academic test prep agency out of Flushing, New York, I knew with my years of teaching and tutoring experience, I could really help kids perform better on college entrance exams and get accepted to top schools. And that's just what we did. But while I was running this agency, I started to have a few interactions with students that made me genuinely sad and which made me more tangibly understand the problems with the education system. After I was done teaching a class one day, I recall one of my students asking me a philosophical question. Immediately, I told him, that's a really interesting question. I proceeded to ask him about how he planned to develop that idea further, at which point I could see the look on his face visibly change from enthusiastic to disappointed. He went on simply to mention that he's planning on studying something completely different in school because he can have a career as whatever. And so, although he went on to perform well on the test and get into a great school, what could have become of that interesting thought he had? Could that have turned into a new invention or business model, a new theory, or even simply a project of his that cultivated his own personal growth? In essence, this single-focused mindset he was locked into made him abandon the one thing the education system preaches: critical thinking. I witnessed a similar attitude at Columbia University when I would attend study groups. Everyone was so competitive, so focused on the grade as the end goal, that the knowledge itself was sacrificed. In other words, the students would do everything they possibly could to get that grade. Memorization, study groups, caffeine, office hours, a little more caffeine, and then more memorization. But once a student was done with the course, that knowledge didn't really matter anymore because they already got the grade, didn't they? In fact, research on what is called the forgetting curve shows that within even 1 hour, learners forget an average of 50% of the information presented, and within a week they forget up to 90% of what they learned. That is, unless they review what they've learned. But let me ask you, how many adults do you think consistently review what they learned in school years ago? Exactly. In fact, that's part of why simple memorization fails as a learning technique. Not only is memorization horrible for long-term retention, but memorization discourages critical thinking skills. Allow me to explain. Often when we're taught a concept or a rule, we're simply taught the rule. This is how to use subjective versus objective pronouns. This is how mitochondria function in a cell. This is how to calculate the probability of 2 successive events, etc. And of course, when we memorize these rules, they may or may not make any sense to us, but we just accept what we're told and shut up. A better way than memorization is a way I've always taught my own students, that is, by engaging our critical thinking. Instead of, this is how to use subjective versus objective pronouns, why not ask? Why do you think subjective pronouns are used one way and objective pronouns another way? Instead of, this is how mitochondria function in a cell, why not ask, why do you think mitochondria function that way? Why do they have the shape they have? Why are they positioned where they are in the cell? It might seem like needless overkill to some people, but engaging our critical thinking skills and understanding the underlying reasoning behind a principle allows us to fully understand it, rather than just accepting it blindly. But once again, because the education system is largely run based on factory efficiency, there's no time or resources for teachers to be able to do this. And trust me, this is in no way the fault of teachers. Contrast this with learning models such as the Montessori system, as well as other project-based learning models. In these systems of education, there's very little memorization being done. Instead, these approaches fully engage our critical thinking skills. In the Montessori approach, learning is achieved by mixing age groups together where young can learn from old and in which children can choose their learning interest and build necessary skills around it. Project-based learning is similar but also different in some key ways. This approach is by far the most scientific approach to learning. A student chooses a project to pursue that is within their interest and then realizes certain skills and knowledge are needed to complete the project. Because the project is of high interest to the student is then highly motivated to learn things like math, writing, and other necessary skills. Whereas traditional education tells us, learn math, writing, and science because we said so. Students in these models have ownership over their learning and therefore actually want to learn. Who would have thought? But if these models are so successful, why aren't they everywhere? Simple. Because they're so much more individualized, they're way more expensive to operate. Teachers already have so much on their plates and often barely make enough even to survive. So asking them to give this level of attention to students within the current sphere of resources would be unthinkable. Oh, and of course it doesn't help that students, at least those in the US, are essentially taught with the purpose in mind of achieving certain scores on state tests. But don't get me started on that. But this all seems so pie in the sky, right? I mean, what really is critical thinking anyway, and why does it matter if at the end of the day, getting a good education to get a good job to put food on the table is all that really matters anyway? Well, critical thinking is the ability to evaluate evidence or logic to make accurate inferences about other people, the world, and ourselves. We've explored why that's so important for actually learning things rather than just getting good grades. But let's understand more fundamentally how it affects both our personal growth and the greater world. Now, despite all the criticisms out there about standardized testing, it actually does have a redeeming quality. For instance, on the SAT and ACT tests, two of the main college entrance exams in the US, there's a reading comprehension section. This section actually tests students on their ability to evaluate a claim given in an answer choice, whether that's A, B, C, or D. Evaluate whether there is evidence for the answer choice in the passage, and then go on to identify whether that answer choice, as opposed to other answer choices, has the most evidence to support it. And honestly, this ability to identify evidence versus non-evidence is a crucial skill. But then once students get to college, they hardly ever use this skill again. That is, unless you take a logic course or a statistics course, and even then, these are usually taught through, you guessed it, memorization. But imagine if every time a teacher or college professor made a statement in class, a student raised their hand and asked, how exactly do we know that? What's the evidence for it? Or how can we logically deduce that? Well, yes, for one thing, it would get annoying and probably sidetrack the class a lot, but hopefully you can understand what I'm getting at here. If we actually trained ourselves to question and demand evidence for every claim presented to us throughout our learning process, not only would we learn and retain the information better, but literally so many new ideas would probably be discovered in the process, because along the way, someone at some point will ask a question that had been so overlooked for so long, but nobody had bothered to even look before. In other words, critical thinking would vastly increase our innovation in science, technology, art, the humanities, and other fields. And as a matter of personal growth, it would literally make us wiser and even more self-determining in our thoughts and behaviors. So then, understanding everything we've discussed here about the education system, how will you treat your own education in and out of school? What is the purpose of your own education? Is it just for a better career? Or is it for a better life? If you want to keep leveling up your critical thinking to make a massive impact in your own life and the lives of others, then be sure to watch this next video.